Good day everybody, today is the 7th of July 2021. My name is Bart Kemp. I'm sitting here with Malcolm Blunt and Peter Ansel's present as well. And we're just going to have a loose talk about Malcolm's archive, where Malcolm has basically had a collection for 25 years worth of research, which I got into touch with. And we're going to start from the very beginning, and this is going to be just a generic talk. There will be some episodes following where we're going to go into finer details because of the incredible amount of documentation we come across. And yeah, why don't we just start? First of all, I've got to ask you, we met for the first time in 2016 at the DPUK seminar in Canterbury, where we where I did a presentation on the second floor lunchroom encounter, the interrogations of Oswald, the Texas School Book Depository, and Prayer Man. It was 2 times 1 hour, and you had to leave on a Sunday, and you gave a USB stick with documents, and I went through them, and it was a lot of varied stuff that contained documents on Nosenko, the Central Intelligence Agency, and especially what got my interest was the document on Oswald. And what the CIA was very good at is actually put Oswald's movements together over 4 pages. That was a really good quality document because it was just summarized very succinct, and it took just the major elements, and also the part of that document was that you could really compare it between employees of the Texas School Book Depository. So they've done an excellent job on that particular thing.
They're capable of doing really good analysis. They really are.
Yeah. And so that was it. I just wanted, my only question with regards to that introduction, because why did you give me that stick? And I've got a second question, is also the original contact that we had that day, that weekend in end of April of 2016, was that you asked me to get some digital copies of some of Harry Livingston's tapes. You asked me about that. Was actually the first thing. So that would be the first question, like, well, you asked me about that. Little did I know how much it actually was, because you just went, oh, it's only a handful of tapes.
Yeah.
And that proved to be about, altogether, between 200 and 300, and with yours mixed in. But especially the USB sticks with the documents. And I wonder if it had anything to do with that I presented with a lot of documentation as such during that. I don't know if you remember.
I think I was immediately struck by the fact that you presented well, and that you were someone that was very interested in the case, deeply interested in the case, and wanted to learn more, and wanted to analyse in depth. I think that's what struck me from the presentations, because that was the first time I actually saw you present.
Yeah.
I thought it was excellent work.
Thanks.
And since then, you've done the interrogations, and that's really, I went back to that recently, because it's in one of my upstairs filing cabinets, and I thought, well, it's about time I really had to dig through this, and I really took a look at it, and the analysis is excellent, really. I mean,
yeah, it was fun to do.
I mean, you're a wasted talent. You should give up photography.
As if. Yeah, well, me personally is that at that time, 2016 and the years before that, there were accessibility to documentation overall was scarce. The archives only put like certain personnel files together of people from, say, Jack Doherty and so forth, and a lot of these so-called employee files were duplicates and very basic things, as like being invited to or summoned to talk for the Warren Commission, do the deposition and so forth. But it wasn't enough, and I was a novice when it came to that. I knew, I was aware of documentation. I looked in Armstrong's archive because that was one of the few archives that was readily available for people to go through. Not the easiest to plow through, but it was there.
Yeah.
And it was, my first thing was like, well, first of all this stuff needs to come out. And then you gave me that USB stick, and I really needed to learn and to see how the documentation works. Every agency has its own little tidbits on those documents when it comes to headers, scribbles, stamps, and so forth. So, you know, that's something to learn of and get acquainted with.
You know, when we look at FBI documents, especially from around the period that you're interested in, the early days, the very early days, the first few days, you know, always flip the documents over because you've got lots of time stamps, date stamps, and signatures about when the information came in and who got it along the chain.
Yeah. You've actually gone further because you know when Hoover signed something or Alan Dulles wrote something, or is this just because you went through so many documents and that you basically got...
So, because you get to learn the handwriting, get to recognise the handwriting. I mean, the most significant one, really, one of the most significant finds, I think, was Cadogan's, James Cadogan, the question document examiner, because what that did was blow a hole in the whole government chain of evidence. Because he said, he testified that I think it was Eisenberg, was the staffer, the Warren Commission staffer, with one person there, sat there, one person, and that was Alan Dulles, as that testimony was given. So,
yeah, I know.
Mr. Dulles was a sharp dude.
Yeah,
he knew there was a problem.
I mean,
and the problem is, of course, they grabbed the evidence early. It went, hundreds of items went in, you know.
Yeah, because it's common knowledge that certain Warren Commission members were barely there. They only came to specific meetings as such, but it's known that Dulles and Rankin and Bellin and they were
Dulles was really micromanaging a lot of the uncomfortable testimony. You know the famous story with Jesse Curry. You know, he got to either 11:15 or 11:30 in the morning, and when Jesse Curry was starting to talk about the pressures coming from Washington for the evidence, you know, all the evidence to leave Dallas. This was on the night of the 22nd of November, and he's starting to talk about the pressures and where this pressure was coming from, and immediately Dulles jumps in. Alan Dulles jumps in and says, I think we'll take a lunch break. This is not the first time when you look through Dulles, he calls lunch breaks early. After lunch, whatever period of time we're looking at, he restarts after lunch by saying to Jesse Curry, Chief Curry, he says, Chief Curry, before lunch we were talking about Detective Revel. So the whole conversation has been buried. And when you look at the transcripts of the testimony, you know, the original testimony in the Warren Commission files, you find great big blanks and spaces, which, I mean, obviously doctored. Obviously doctored.
So I want to go back to the very beginning. Why did you create your own archive?
I don't think it was a creation of an archive so much. It was just the acquisition of stuff. You know, stuff that, you know, because I looked at it, I tend to look at stuff that way instead of that way. You know, some people are very focused on their research, and they don't go outside of those lines. But right from the get-go, I wanted to look at lots of things. You know, it's a big case, and a lot of people were involved. A lot of organisations were involved. And you can't, to my mind, I don't think you can exclude things, because you'll find connections right on the periphery which connect to something in the centre, you know. It was, yeah, I think it was the acquisition of stuff that may come in useful in the future. I mean, some of the stuff, obviously, you know, that I copied was not stuff I was particularly interested in at the time. But as the years go on, you think, oh, thank goodness I copied that.
I've learned that when I started to digitise your collection.
So it didn't start out as, you know, a meaningful archive. It was just the acquisition of stuff with the idea that some of the stuff could be useful in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are many facets that have been barely touched, or if they have been, they just scraped off the surface, and they ought to dig deeper by going through the documentation as such, and it allows them.
I think it terrifies a lot of people.
Of course.
You know, the sheer volume of
no, that's the thing. Well, it's
terrified
me.
You have to wrestle with it NARA, you know.
Yeah.
It's just huge.
Yeah, but you've done the hard work. That's the thing. I mean, but let's just get back to the beginning. Dallas was your first port of call when it comes to evidence.
Yeah.
So you went to the Dallas Municipal Archives.
Yeah.
Cindy Smolovic, who assisted you.
Excellent person.
Yeah.
Very supportive, and couldn't do enough, really, to help. I mean, later on at NARA, I found a difference. You know, some people weren't so helpful. But the first experience with an archivist working with in those records was excellent. It was really good.
When did you start? Was it the middle of the 90s, or?
I think it was just about a year after ARSB. So that would have been 94.
Right. So from you obviously already partially answered the question about that you wanted to see the many facets and aspects of it as such, and that you therefore also branched out with the Cubans. But before I get to the Cubans, actually, you worked together with John Armstrong in those years as well.
Sure.
How did that work? Did you just give him all the work that you had done? Did he have access to all of it? Did he? Because
totally open access.
Yeah.
Totally. I was looking for. I mean, I was almost programmed to look for Oswald stuff through the FBI files, through the Oswald files, the 105 files, the 110.461 files, JFK investigation files, the 62 series file, the 89A series files. There's just masses of stuff which contain information on Oswald, and then related organisations like INS and obviously CIA to a certain extent, but not too much. It was really, the focus was on mainly FBI files because there was so much stuff there.
There is
so much material.
There is an unbelievable amount of material, and
when you go into the field office files, it gets even more. We're talking, it's huge. Hundreds and hundreds of boxes, hundreds and hundreds of boxes of material. And, you know, you get to the stuff when the review board is looking at some of the FBI files. And what interested me, particularly when I got to the ARB, looking at the FBI files, was the file destructions they had. FBI were destroying files, you know, right into the mid-90s. You know, they destroyed files on Sergio Carter Smith, New Orleans interest. Masses and masses of stuff they were destroying. Jack Ruby files were destroyed.
When you went for so the collaboration with Armstrong, what was it till I mean, from a research point of view and getting the the stuff that he used for his book, what was that, till 98 or something like that? And did you then decide to go into the Cuban thing, or did it overflow, or how did that actually
Yeah,
work?
I think there was, it was a bit of mix and match because, I was still doing working with John on the Oswald thing probably through 98, 99. But then I got to meet Gordon Winslow in Miami and got into the Cuban stuff as well. So,
What fascinated you about the Cuban stuff?
I thought there was, I think I sort of reverse engineered that from the Watergate. I saw these characters that turned up in the Watergate. They were all Cuban exiles involved in the burglary, and that interested me. And I thought, well, what was the outgrowth of these? What organisations did they belong to? What Cuban exile groups did they belong to? And Bernard Barker, who was he? Where did he come from? And then you discover he's a CIA asset. So
Yeah.
there's lots of interesting stuff in the Cuban collection.
Yeah, I totally agree that is very interesting, but I also find it that it's like it's like a thick tree with many branches on it as such. I think Dallas
I would agree
isn't.
with that, definitely.
Yeah, Dallas isn't that branched out as much as the Cubans are, because the Cubans, the cryptonyms for operations and people as such, are just numerous and
Endless.
yeah, and endless. Numerous and endless. The amount of it as well. Those people that are listening in, they should go to Mary Farrell, because Mary Farrell has an incredible collection on the Cuban files. Mm-hmm. There's a good amount in Malcolm's archives, but in this case it gets surpassed by Mary Farrell, because the amount of material they basically plastered on the website as such.
Although I have to say that some of the stuff on the Cuban research didn't make it back to here. A lot of the stuff that I copied in 98, 99 actually went to Baylor via Ed Sherry.
Okay.
So that stuff is in a lot of my Cuban stuff is at Pogue Library in Baylor, at Waco.
That's good to know.
Yeah, so that's in Ed Sherry's collection.
Right. Okay. So you did this for about 3 years, roughly.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
And then what? So the logical connection to the agency is there, of course, because you see all the shenanigans in the background and all the documentation about this and the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Cuban exiles and so forth.
Well, there's much more released during the tenure of the review board. I mean, John Newman really worked miracles with Oswald and the CIA, because he was working from heavily redacted documents. How he managed to do what he did, it was a miracle, really. He did very, very well.
He also has a very good perception of what's written and what's scribbled and what stamps mean, etc., etc.
Yeah. We've talked about that at length.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think he did well. But then later on, of course, when he was almost like in reverse, that's when lots of documentation came out, lots of extra material, and he really wasn't. He'd done his bit, if you know what I mean. Carried his load.
He did the groundwork. Yeah.
With that first, I mean, was it 2 million documents? The first release.
Yeah.
In the early 90s. And he'd been through that with Peter Dale Scott, and I think they'd looked through a lot of this stuff. And then later, following the review board directive, there was a lot more meat on the bone. A lot more really good CIA releases, not so heavily redacted. And they actually released. 2003 they released CIA segregated files from microfilm, which a lot of the stuff was, which was never even looked at by the House Select Committee. It was gathered, but they didn't have time to look at it. So all that stuff was released as well.
Speaking of the ARB, it's around the time that you were actually started to delve into documents, first Dallas, then the Cubans, and then the agency as such. Did you have any involvement with the ARB? Chats, talks, pointers, or what I mean, or did you?
I used to write. I remember writing to Tom Samaluk a few times, and I met Eileen Sullivan at the ARB offices in Washington a few times. Sent suggestions, ideas, where they should look, what they should look at. But I mean, they were getting that from hundreds of people. I mean, they're getting lots of where you should be looking. Yeah.
I know, but also at the same time, there was a lot of people that basically sent their thesis or their idea of what happened during,
Absolutely.
and wrote to the ARB and go, well, this is my piece, this is what I'm thinking, and I'm thinking, you're wasting the ARB's time with these so-called, well, some of them at least.
Some people also who said that the ARB was sent on a wild goose chase with the Mexico City stuff. You know, they really dug into the Mexico City and, you know, trying to work out what was going on with Oswald and all the rest of it. But it's like, I'm always, with that stuff, I think it's, in my opinion, I think it's just a rabbit trail. You never get anywhere with it.
You called it the swamp before, the swamp.
Yeah, that was the conversation I had with John, you know, at the archives.
I mean, from what I've read from your archive, I think there's not much to support actually that Oswald was there, because the so-called fellow passages in Laredo, you've got a fair amount of work on that. Hardly anyone can substantiate that Oswald was on that bus. The way Duran was treated by the Mexican
when
police.
we go back, like you always do, you try and, with your material in Dallas, you're trying to go back and see what really happened at the beginning. If you look at what happened at the beginning with Oswald's entry into Mexico,
Yeah.
boy, that is fascinating.
Yeah, that is very good.
It's all over the place.
Yeah.
In those first few days, you know, they just can't get the story right. Can't get it right.
It all, in this case, and it doesn't matter with what I'm doing with the second floor lunchroom encounter or with the interrogations, the best way to find out is put it in the timeline manner and go, the
Well, you're very much
documentations
like John Armstrong.
and
That's
the data.
exactly how he works.
Yeah, and the-
timelines, chronos. He's really
Who said
into
what
that.
at what
But he
time?
always used to say that to me. You got to be disciplined about this. Look at the timelines. Look at the chronos. You two are so alike.
Somebody's laughing very hard right now, or actually a few people will be laughing very hard right now. But anyway, you got me on that one. What I'll tell the crowd is this. So in 2018, I just had an operation, and I came out, and Malcolm, because the thing with the offer to digitize the tapes from Harrison Edward Livingston, to digitize, and he said, oh, there's a handful, and I said, okay, so I'll tell you what, I'll come over because I've been in the hospital for 10 days and I've had enough, and I need some movement. And my leg was wrapped up and it looked like a balloon, and I had it in one of these so-called boots you strap on. And the so-called handful of tapes became about around 250 cassette tapes, and which was really interesting. And then I got to Tetbury, and Tetbury is a place about 45 minutes. It's in the middle of the Cotswolds, and we went into a property that Malcolm had, and he stored his archives, but also Harry Livingston's archive, and there were about 35 plastic cases filled with folders, neatly organized, and cassette tapes. And the next thing I knew, I had a whole bag, a big shopping bag filled with tapes to take home. And it's a fair amount of work. But the good thing about tapes is that you can just press the button and hit record on your computer and walk away, and afterwards you just edit it a little bit down, the tape flip, you edit that out, and you have the recording digitized, so it's not that difficult. It's not that labor intensive, you can do other things at the same time. But what then became obvious was that there was a load of material, obviously regarding the autopsy and the medical material. And Livingston was a meticulous researcher as well. But the thing what he did, and what a lot of people should praise him for, is the fact that he called everybody. He called everybody. When I say everybody, he called everybody. And he called them he called 3-4 people in a row, had the tape playing and just recorded it non-stop. Didn't make it easier for me because I had to re-record things and stuff like that and edit. But it was quite daring. It's something that not many researchers dare to do by just risking it. And there were a few phone calls that are quite rude and they're quite funny. But on top of that, there came his work. And Livingston is different than you are, in the sense that if he had 2 or 3 people involved in a certain chapter of a book, he would make 3 copies, and he would because all his files were aimed at the person itself. So if you had a fat file that was 2 inches thick and it just said Dr. Fink, then everything about Fink in all these books was in there. But at the same time, maybe Dr. Berkeley was there, Admiral Berkeley had the same involvement in something as such, then that passage or those pages from the book was in that particular file as well. Which brings me to yours. You had no real system in place, because what I found out, for instance, was that it was all over the place.
Correct.
It's devoid of organization in a normal sense.
And I'm not excusing it because it's chaotic, and I sympathise with anybody that's trying to put it in some sort of order. But what it does is it makes you look at your files.
I know.
I know so many people, researchers, they have their files and they're all nice and they never look at them. They never look at them. Very rarely.
Yeah, they've put it all neatly away, but that's quite an interesting point. But at the same time, it was incredibly frustrating for me to go through, because then the folder said like Marina Oswald, and you go up and you go, but that's DOJ, and that's Robert Couch, and that's Hoover, and that's Dulles, and it's got nothing to do with Marina, and things got moved around, and I ended up creating a system that that just happened while I went through the whole thing. Because let me get back to the story, is that the first few months I worked on the Livingston files for about 3 months, and then in Feb 2019 Malcolm works from 9 till 5 roughly, but I go and I'm in hog heaven, because there's documentation left, right and center, and I'm going, this isn't in the book, I don't know about this, I don't know about this. So one evening after dinner, we had dinner together, and then I went back. Are you going back in? Yeah, I'm going back in. I'm going to just do another 4 hours. And I go back in, and then I started to look at Malcolm's material, because I was sitting in the front room and Malcolm sat in the back between his chest of drawers that he had, file drawers, and I had a room where all the plastic cases were, and with all the files from Harry. And then I started to, and I'm fairly familiar with what was available on Baylor and just in general what has been posted on forums as such. But then I pick up an HSCA report on Will Fritz, for instance, and nobody knew about this, and I was like, well, this is gold. And then I just went through it and I was like, but I've got to do this, and I've got to. There's so much stuff in there that no one knows about or has published, or it's not available online, or people have been talking about it, and especially in the bit that I'm talking about is Oswald's last 48 hours roughly,
Yeah.
that there was so much in there, and I was like, but nobody will notice unless I put this out, because I was like, and that changed everything, because what was supposed to be a little job then turned into a job that was going to be for another 4 or 5 months, because you were selling the property as such.
Sure.
But it just kept going on and on and on. And due to that, the structure of the whole thing, because at first you only gave me the old files, which have certain perforations in the papers as such, 3 and 2, and the color of the folders as well, because they were dark green instead of
different,
forest green, yeah. So, and you said, that's the old stuff. If you find them, take them. Okay, fine. So, all of a sudden, my work, I wouldn't say quadrupled, I'd say increased tenfold, basically, because of the amount of material you had. And it was just all just stuck in drawers. There are names on there, this, that, and the other. But the funny thing was, and I'll talk about what for me was just the biggest gold nugget I found, was the Hosty document. And the funny thing was that I just opened the drawer and just picked one folder and just ticked it out. And I was like, oh, this says Hosty. Okay, let's have a look. And there was about 100 pages of notes in it. And some of them were quite bleached out, like 3rd, 4th generation copy type of stuff. And I was just going, yeah. And then I started reading, and it's the handwritten notes that get to me, because the handwritten notes always mention something that's not typed out. That's my experience, and it's especially with the interrogations of Oswald. Handwritten notes are different, and this happened to be a notation on about 4 paragraphs of material on Oswald's interrogation. And first of all, I was like, wow, I haven't seen this before. And of course the prayer man thing then comes in, about Oswald standing outside and, you know, watching the parade, watching the presidential parade. And to me that was just like such dynamite that I was like, yeah, this is just absolutely amazing. And the funny thing is that it happened at the beginning while I was doing it. It's like the first week in February. So that meant for me right away, like, I've got to go through this whole collection. Because one piece of paper, and it just went, and there's like 20 file cabinets, and I'm going, am I actually, and because it was that disorganized as such, it basically, there's stuff that doesn't interest me. Personally, I don't care much about talk about HSCA and CIA and stuff like that. I mean, you know, there are certain people that come forward that, again, I have never heard of it before, that had quite a lot of correspondence as such between each other during those times, especially Blakey and what's his name? His name eludes me, from the agency. I'll get back to it in a sec. So you have all these patterns of people that are in correspondence with each other, which of course I had absolutely no knowledge of whatsoever. But that made me even more fanatical about wanting to go through the old files, and especially look at the FBI stuff. And of course you start to look at the Minox, you start to look at the evidence itself, and I started reading your article, and I'm going, well, he's done his homework, he's got, well, there's at least 8 inches of paperwork on just the evidence. Of course there's duplicates, this, that and the other, but at the same time there's a lot of that about it. And you come, at the end of all that paperwork, you came out with 6 scenarios in that article, and you said either he did this, either he did that, or such and such, because the dates don't match up. There's something really iffy going on, but they don't, I don't know whether they want to throw it deliberately on a confusing trail, confuse you, or whether they are, they were just so sloppy and departments just didn't work properly.
Well, that's another huge...
it's an enigma.
A huge set of material to look at, which is the bulkies. And I gave you the index for the bulkies.
Yeah.
Which runs many pages. It's just like loads and loads of material in there relating to the early stuff.
Yeah.
So that's really those are really essential files to look at.
Scott Breckenridge, that was his name. That's whatever. Blakey and Scott Breckenridge, basically talking about files, this, that, and the other, and always constant bickering about trying to get the files back, or and things like that. But they are stories by itself.
But the difficulty is, you see, you were talking about the evidence and how it was handled, the photographic evidence, and how this stuff went backwards and forwards in that first few weeks, really.
Yeah.
And how they were trying to, what the FBI were doing was, and John Hunt found this, John found exactly what I found. There was constant renumbering by the FBI, and it was all done to obscure holes, bloody great big holes in what they were doing. The actual Dallas police evidence film was just screwed around with, totally screwed around with, and I tried to make sense of it. But I mean, you've got the paperwork on that, but you can see what they were trying to do. But further along the line, all that stuff was renumbered. All the evidence numbers are changed, and they're changed again, and they're changed again, and they're changed again.
Yeah.
But you can't.
This is the same with the.
That's what John was doing. John Hunt was actually clarifying all that stuff, actually pushing it back together so you could understand it. And then of course he died, suddenly.
Suddenly.
Yeah.
Let's not go there. Suspicious. Yeah. So that's a really good example of what's in your archive, because if I were to advise anyone who is interested in this subject, you can watch a documentary, but the issue with the documentary is that you have somebody basically summarizing the entire paperwork load into one sentence or two sentences, and that's what you got to do with. And whereas that's a really bad thing, because if you really want to make sense of it, you have to go through the paperwork, and then even once you've done that, you'd still need 20 minutes just to explain in a nutshell type of form and say, like, well, this is actually what happened. Now, I understand that documentaries want to try and get as many different bits together to basically come to some story, but it couldn't be further removed from the actual story as such, because the actual nuances and the actual people that are involved, etc., etc., give you an entirely different picture of what actually people are saying as such. Now, this is what I found out with the interrogations, for instance, because my opinion at first was that of the 4 papers that I'm writing, I thought it was going to be the easiest paper of all, and yet it turned out to be the most difficult one, because, and that's another thing, I didn't know there was that much of it actually written about the interrogations, whereas there was very little available online at that time until I got, well, I managed to get bits from archive here and there, this, that, and the other, and I had a pretty cool story together. But it was nothing until I got into your archive, because then I managed to basically, I got some kind of lightning bolt in my head, because I was like, I need to put this in a timeline. What I inadvertently did with the second floor lunchroom encounter paper was I did it in a timeline sense, because I just said, I'm going to start and I'm going to use Baker and Truly's route through the building. That was the timeline, without calling it a timeline. And when I wrote on the interrogations paper, the first 2 years, it was cluttered, and it was 450 pages almost. And then I decided to turn everything around, because when I was watching 2 videos, I understood that the videos were from opposite angles. So it was it's the bit where Oswald's been indicted for murdering Tippett at 7:15 on the 22nd, and there was a camera that basically was aiming at room 317, Fritz's homicide and robbery and homicide bureau, and coming out and said, I've been given a hearing without legal representation, and they say, did you shoot? No, sir, I didn't shoot anyone, blah, blah, blah. But then there was a camera which is right next to the elevator entrance, which is only 20 feet away, because everybody shoots in wide angle. It looks the longest corridor in the world, and he films basically like that. So it's like an L-shaped form with the long short bit on the entrance and then the corridor shot. And it was the same sequence basically, but shot from different angles. And then I knew also from the paperwork that there was another video where he came from the Davis sisters lineup half an hour later, and that was roughly at 20 to 8, and that's filmed as well. It's the Patsy sequence before he gets dragged back into the room as such. So when I knew I could place those at the time, I went, you know what, that's the answer to what you're doing. You need to put it in timeline fashion, because then, so I ended up basically chucking out 140 pages of material, which I dropped on my website, because a lot of it also had nothing to do with the actual interrogations.
Should be a book.
And
You know, because it's very readable. It's seamless.
yeah,
You've done a good job with that. And, you know, that needs to be in a book, really.
I don't know. Because then, you know what, the thing is, what I did in a PDF was because I put the documents right there at that time. This Weisberg did a similar method. Yeah, but I mean, it's also cluttered and all over the place. But I was like, well, you know what, one pet hate of mine with a book is that I have to go to the back of the book because I'm like, oh yeah, what do you base that on? Okay, and then I have to go to the back of the book and find out and go, oh, Warren report, blah blah blah, and I'm going, what? And you know, when you have a book like JFK and the Unspeakable, this is a 1,1300 page book. Your wrist is absolutely buggered at the end of it because you can't hold it properly. It's too big, and you keep going backwards and forwards. It was actually that book. The fact that I'm in interactive technology has also got something to do, and I was like, I want everything right there. So if I say this is what happened, everything is linked, or it's right there in front of you, and you go, oh yeah, it's right there. Okay, I get it. So if it were to have to be a book, it would be in this similar vein as such, because
Right.
I wouldn't have, you know, I'd have an index with mentionings and stuff, but the actual source node as such would be the document or the link to an interactive thing. And that's why I did that. That's why I did PDFs. And the other thing is also, PDFs you can edit. So I've done 6 versions now of the interrogation, of the second floor lunchroom paper, and 4, this is my 4th edit coming out in a few months, on the interrogations as such. And I was just like,
It's refining and refining. That's good.
tweaking it, yeah, just, you know, so, but that was for me at that point. So back to the timeline matter, is also, it gave me a sense of completion and going like, well, this bit is covered really well. I don't have to add anything to this anymore. I don't have to speculate, which I hate anyway. And I just, the documentation
That's
does the
always a
talking.
big danger, you know.
Many writers do this, and I
It's
thought,
very tempting.
I know, it's really like probably or maybe. I think that I believe
It might well be. It may well be. It's possibly that. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
exactly. So, but and that was for me also the reason. Then I go, no, I'm just going to shove the evidence down your throat, and you can't go against it as
That's
such.
good.
The only 2 criticisms I had was that I left inadvertently 2 pages out from a Secret Service report that I didn't know that were there. So when they pointed to me at it, I was like, cool, I can add them to it and just say, right, there, it's there. Other than that, nobody can, and that's not to pat myself on the back, but it's just like something like, well, if you want to go against what's written in this thing, you better show me the evidence and prove to me that I'm wrong, instead of just coming there.
So I talked to those people at Georgetown University, and they said the guy I spoke to was a guy called Scott Taylor. And Scott said, "Yeah, fine, come on over." I get over to Georgetown University. I was coming over anyway for NARA, but I get over there. I go to Georgetown. I go to the special collections, and he says to me, "I'm sorry, Mr. But it's closed. Box 3 is closed for research." I said, "Well, I've come all the way over from England to look at this stuff." And he said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll ring Mr. Arsler, Fulton Arsler, that was the editor of Reader's Digest at one time. And he got him in New York. He was although he was very ancient in years, he was travelling between Los Angeles and New York. He got him in New York, and he said, "There's a guy here from England that wants to look at box 3. Is it possible he can look at it?" And he said, "No, couldn't look at it." So I thought, "Oh well, there we go." And then several years later, when I got to know Pete Bagley, I was talking to Pete about the difficulties of getting access to stuff in private collections, and mentioned Fulton Arsler, and he said, "Oh, Tony, he's a friend of mine." So he calls him up and says, "This friend of mine, Malcolm Blunt, he wants to look at a particular file box in your collection." And he said, "Well, yeah, no problem." So I confirmed that by email before I left, a few months later, before I left the UK, with Arsler, and he said, "Yeah, that's okay." So I get to Georgetown University several months later, after the conversation with Pete Bagley, and again it's no, you can't look at it. I said, "Well, I've had an email. I've got email here." Anyway, I said, "Well, call him up." So they did. They phoned up Arsler, and that's a very loud voice on the phone said, "Mr. Blunt, look at box number 3. And so the box was retrieved from the back and brought out, and everybody was gathered around, and it was put onto a table.
Full of dust?
It was covered in dust. All the tape on it, there was tape across the top, which looked like it had never been tampered with. So it got the tape off, opened up the box, no Marine Corps interviews in there at all. And Epstein, I think, got to around 100, his researchers, whereas if you go to the Warren Commission, they got to 10. You know, those are crucial people too. That Epstein, I think you've got the list. You must have the list. I got the Reader's Digest list of Marines.
I'm surprised anyway about the amount of stuff there is around on the Marines.
Yeah, they actually gave all the names of these Marines that they interviewed. You know, and I say you can compare that with the Warren Commission. It's just a few people, 10 people, I think, 10 Marines. So those interviews disappear. Again, we've stuff we lost.
Have you? That's one of your biggest moments when it comes to disappeared stuff. How have you? How much have you had other experiences as such like that, where you just
walk the in? US Customs and INS material in the church files. They interview. It's there. They refer to it in the drafts, the church committee drafts. You can see the dates they interviewed these people, the number of pages of testimony. But it's not there. It's gone. I can't find it.
But the church committee is probably a committee that exposes the most when it comes to agency.
They got to a lot of stuff. That's true. They got to a lot of stuff. But I wrote to NARA about that, and I think I said there were at least 50 missing pieces of either interviews or testimony. And eventually they got some back to me, and they said, "No, we found there were only 33. Well, 33 pieces of key testimony and interviews, 50. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but that's still a lot of crucial material. Oswald's interaction in New Orleans with customs and INS is essential to understand. It's gone. It's all gone.
Yeah, there are.
Don't tell me.
There are bits.
These people that seem to think it's all settled business. It's not settled business at all. That stuff wouldn't be gone if it didn't mean something.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if
it would still be there for us to look at.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, because it just leads to things they don't want us to know.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right, NARA, how frustrating is it to be there?
In the early days, it wasn't so bad, although we used to complain about things.
Such as?
The fact that we could never get enough material. You know, we always wanted more. We're sort of like it's the JFK equivalent of dope addicts. we always wanted more. And you know, I suppose the nitpicking of people, the way the system works, you've got to take you can't take more than one file out of a box. It's just got to be one file at a time, and then you've got to take the file up to be checked before you photocopy it, and then you have to get somebody to take out any staples and stuff like that. It was difficult, and FBI files were notoriously difficult because they were all in these binders, you know, 4-ring or 3-ring binders, and the document you wanted to copy could be right at the bottom, so you had to take everything out.
Yeah, I've seen some of those photocopies where it just looks really messed up on the top.
And then sometimes if you what you try and do is shortcut and have the file like that. That's where you get it messed up on a copier. And then of course they'd object to us doing that. Rightly so. Rightly so. You should take everything apart. But it takes so long to take the file.
Especially when you look at 300 boxes of something and you go...
Yeah. So that was a difficulty.
And then now, you get less boxes and all that, and it's more...
Yeah, it's all changed. Yeah, it's all changed. It's down to one cart, 16 boxes. And I think it looks like the rules, we used to be able to work together as teams. And you get more boxes and more carts, but I think that, from what I heard from the guy I work with at NARA, a paid researcher, he said it's all changed. You know, you can't work as a team anymore. So that's changed. But we had the good times, and we didn't really recognise we had the good times. I mean, we were able to look at the original Oswald evidence. You can't do that now.
No, you need to have a really good reason if you want to look at the gun or things like that, the artifacts as such. Autopsy folders are an absolute nightmare as well.
Well, she wrote a page. There was an archivist called Trudy
Peterson.
Trudy Hooskamp Peterson. She's not long retired, I don't think. Maybe in the last 3 or 4 years she's retired. But she wrote a directive saying that you couldn't look at the evidence anymore unless you had a really good reason to look at it.
Yeah. People that were writing a book or something like that.
Sure.
That's what it was. Not just...
Even then they would refuse. I mean, I saw them refuse people. You know, and read some of the material where they've rejected people that have asked to look at certain pieces of evidence or photograph certain pieces of evidence. So they went through a period where they were photographing the evidence themselves, and then they would say to you, well, you don't need to look at the evidence, you can look at the photographs.
Yeah.
But the photographs don't set you up for things like the notebook. Oswald's little notebook. When you handle that, it's like you can see what they should be doing with that book, because it's full of indentations. You know, with a good person that's qualified in ESDA, they could bring a lot of Oswald's writing to the surface, page by page by page by page. And there's a lot of it in that notebook. It's not done, you know.
That's almost as good as glue in the Minox camera shot.
Oh, Jesus.
They must have used Gorilla Glue for the first time.
What they used in that, but you can't move that. There's no way, and it feels heavy. It feels heavy in your hand, you know. Definitely heavier than the the Minuxes that I've handled. I've handled two, a black one and a silver one. One was civilian issue, and I always get this wrong. The one was either the black was military or silver was military. I can't remember now. And one was civilian.
Okay, I'm gonna call it a day. It's a good first talk between us. There'll be more, and eventually go together with the archive as such. It'll be. It's a great way of going through, and I will have to explain a few bits about it, how it works. But yeah, it's been fun, and it's gonna be fun still to plow through it. I was amazed by how much New Orleans stuff you have, for instance. It's unbelievable. Garrison, and even Jim Diogenio went back to me and went, "I've never heard of this guy." And I'm thinking, you're the #1 guy on this, and you know, so that was surprising. And on top of that, the whole thing with Shaw and Ferry, and you know, the documents of the Central Intelligence Agency about Shaw, whether his connections and so forth. What's his name? The FBI informant with us. It's not Verona, but it is Verona, wasn't it? Who's the guy in New Orleans? I mentioned his name, but again, it eludes me. Pena, Orestes Pena.
Well, that's a story and a half.
There's
so many places you can go where there's a story. If you
it's
go
unbelievable.
to the mid-70s,
Yeah.
you suddenly find there's a mass destruction within all over the place of Pena files.
And there's still a lot left.
It's destroyed.
Yeah. So that's another thing in your archive. You can really see how much file destruction has been going on as such.
I didn't get to all of it.
No, it's a really good pointer. Yeah, that shows how much destruction actually happened, and also just things that disappeared, and all kinds of schmoozing and excuses coming up and go, yeah, it's protocol that we get rid of these, and I'm thinking.
Well, even the people that came calling, like the HFCA went after the U.S. Customs for their files on Cuban exiles, and they refused to give them. They refused to give the HFCA, and they said they were in Miami. They said they had to have authorization from headquarters, and the stuff. Because they said they were too voluminous. They had too much stuff. They didn't want to give it. They didn't want to give the stuff. So what happened to all the US Customs stuff?
Yeah.
You know how much US Customs stuff there is at the National Archives? One grey file box with 3 documents.
Really?
That's how much we've lost there. And if you've ever seen, I mean, you see FBI documents with copies of US Customs documents. They are like dense. The whole page is typefit. They've got so much stuff on the page. We've lost a lot. We've lost a huge amount.
Well, that'll be subject for another talk. I'm signing off. Thank you very much.
No problem.
And we'll meet again.
Don't know where, don't know where.